This is the Cancer Interviews podcast, and I'm your host, Bruce Morton. Multiple myeloma is a rare blood cancer that forms in a white blood cell called a plasma cell. Our guest was diagnosed with this cancer, has overcome it, and has a powerful story to tell you. He is Gregory Proctor of San Antonio, Texas, and his story is one that should resonate with anybody diagnosed with any cancer. So here he is, Gregory Proctor. And Gregory, welcome to Cancer Interviews.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for having me on the show.
What we like to do with each of our interviews when we start is find out a little bit about our guest, exclusive of their cancer journey, Gregory. So if you would, tell us a bit about where you're from, what you do for work, and what you do for fun.
Yeah, I obviously, as you mentioned in my bio or interview there, I'm a cancer survivor. Professionally, I'm a project controls specialist or project controls manager. So I do a lot of work for the Department of Energy and a lot of commercial sectors here domestically as well as abroad. I'm also an avid podcaster and a co-founder of TrueSpot Technologies.
And what does TrueSpot Technologies do?
TrueSpot Technologies is an augmented reality program, which basically allows for viewers to have virtual seats anywhere in the world to any type of sporting event, concert, or large gathering. So we've built an application for that.
Now let's get to your cancer journey. Gregory, with you, with myself as a cancer survivor, with any of us who has been on a cancer journey, there was this unfortunate juncture in which we noticed something tied to our health. Something wasn't quite right. And for you, what was that and how did it manifest itself?
Well, for me, it started to manifest probably in April, May of 2021, where I started to have lower back pain. Was running a lot of podcasts and sitting on my derriere as we would all do as podcasters, and realized I was starting to have lower back pain. And that lower back pain was just nagging. It wasn't quite as persistent as it was to a point to where after about a month, or should I say probably about 3.5, 4 weeks, where I couldn't get out of bed. And at that point, it was fairly catastrophic because my lower extremities, I could not move.
Everybody has a different story in terms of their cancer journey. And one of the variables in that very complex equation is the quickness with which they sought medical attention or lack of quickness. In your case, were you quick to seek medical attention?
Well, Bruce, when you wake up in the morning and your lower extremities cannot move your legs, you can't move your legs, you're looking at your body saying, what is going on with me? It almost feels like an out of mind, out of body experience. The first thing you want to do is try to seek medical attention right away, which that is exactly what I did. I managed to muster up the courage to get myself out of bed, get on some clothes, and literally crawl down the stairs to our vehicle and get myself over to my primary healthcare doctor. And at that point, his assumption during the initial diagnosis was maybe you slipped a disc or pulled a muscle. And of course, they ran blood work and x-rays and so forth and so on. And for me, the next 48 hours after having that examination, the pain never went away. It just continued to persist and become even more intensified and agonizing. And I knew I had to seek other medical attention at that point in time.
So you went to a specialist?
I went to a specialist. That is correct.
And what did the specialist tell you? What sort of tests were run, that sort of thing?
So the specialist brought me into his office and, he examined me, of course. We ran x-rays and he said, well, first thing we need to do is get you over for an MRI. So that was the very first test, significant test that was performed very early on after I sought medical attention to try and figure out what was going on with me. And the MRI that they ran was a non-contrast MRI. They were able to identify that there was a mass on my upper right hip area, right around my T7, T8 vertebrae there. And they said, well, we can't really define whether or not it's benign or cancerous. So we're going to have to bring you back for a contrast MRI. And so it was very discouraging and frustrating early on to know that there was something going on, but we were kind of unaware as to what it truly was. And it took almost approximately another 3 weeks before I could get in for the contrast MRI for them to actually tell us that we needed to see an oncologist.
By the way, we're confident you'll be able to learn some tips and tools to help you through your personal cancer journey. But first, we'd like to invite you to please give us a like, leave a comment, or review below, and share this story with your friends. Kindly click on the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon so you'll be notified when we release our next cancer interview. And if you or a loved one are facing a cancer diagnosis, please click on the link in the description and show notes below to check out our free guide, The Top 10 Things I Wish I Knew When I First Got Cancer. Now, Gregory, you are, as you lead us through the chronology of events with your journey, you're about to embark on this 3-week waiting period. I cannot imagine that mentally or emotionally that was easy at all, because, as you said, you know something's wrong, but at this point, you don't know what is wrong. What were those 3 weeks like?
Well, to be, excuse me, to be honest with you, Bruce, those 3 weeks were filled with anxiety, concern, worry, sense of doubt, because I had always lived my life being very healthy, very athletic, and just trying to live somewhat of a prosperous a life through health. But when I was going through that period of time, I just started kind of reflecting on, well, what have I done wrong? You begin to have a sense of insecurity and doubt. And at those stages, you really don't want to start to go into a depression mode or dark stage in your life. But you start to kind of have those sense of thoughts cross your mind and begin to realize that what am I going to do next if this happens to be the worst case scenario?
So at this point, we're not at a medical phase yet. We're about to get there. We're at sort of a hearts and minds phase.
Mhm.
Were there any external sources that helped you deal with that?
Well, obviously, for me, I had friends, local friends that were obviously praying for my wife and I. My family was, also praying. My faith is based on Christianity, being a Southern Baptist. So, I started to turn and pour as much energy as I could into my faith at that point in time. But overall, faith being one component, you're still living the vast reality of not knowing what is really happening, within those first couple weeks. And for me and my wife, it just became very difficult for us to kind of cope with things because we were starting to hear words like lymphoma, multiple myeloma, it could be this, it could be that, and us not really knowing, well, which direction or path are we really going to have to go down this journey on? And so it wasn't until we got around to having that second MRI, contrast MRI, and that was, as I say, the catalyst that really, struck a chord for us.
Okay, a massive two-part question. The contrast MRI, what did it reveal? And based on that, what did your doctor tell you?
Well, we're still at the specialist at this point in time, and so we went in for the MRI. My wife was with me. We went in for the MRI, and I want to express something here very, very clearly and kind of be a little bit transparent. A lot of times, we have a sixth sense in our mind, and basically it tells us that something is going to go wrong, and you just start to kind of have, a more clear awareness of things around you in your environment. So I had the MRI. I came out of the MRI machine, and I just looked at the technician, and I wanted to ask her so desperately, well, can you tell me anything? And of course, they technically can't. But the expression on her face said it all. And so when we went back to the specialist and we stepped into his office, it wasn't even 5 minutes. And he looked at my wife and I and he said, Mr. and Mrs. Proctor, you guys need to seek an oncologist right now. And we asked him, we said, Well, can you go into any detail? He said, I would prefer not. This is outside of my professional practice regimen. You need to see an oncologist. And, I've got a friend of mine that I went to college with. He's an oncologist. We can see if we can get you into his office, which that did not work out for us. And we sought other oncology expertise. And we're thankful that the circumstances happened the way that they did, because, as they always say, count your blessings, as they come. And for everyone that's on my team of 8 doctors today, I count my blessings each and every day for each and every last one of them, because they were brought into my life basically to save my life.
And when you saw that oncologist, I suspect in relatively short order, that's when you got the bad news.
Well, we still had more series of tests to go through, even though the contrast MRI lit up like a Christmas tree. There were signs of cancer literally throughout, my lower extremities, which was in my right hip area, as well as throughout my body for bone lesions, which multiple myeloma does. We went through another series of blood work, more scans, and then, of course, a bone marrow biopsy. And for me, that was the first time ever going through that procedure, which was the most painful, excruciating procedure that I've ever had done in my entire life, because I've really never been in a hospital or broken any bones throughout my 52 years of living. And having someone stick a needle into your lower hip and extracting the bone marrow tissue out, and you're only on local anesthesia, I would always err on the side of caution when I hear newly diagnosed people saying, hey, I've just been diagnosed with multiple myeloma. And I tell them, if you're getting a bone marrow biopsy, make sure you do it under anesthesia. Don't do it locally, because it is excruciating. I mean, it is the worst tolerable pain that I can ever imagine going through. So at that point, to answer your question, I'm sorry, I got a little bit off there, but to answer your question, when we went back in, which was after the bone marrow biopsy and all the blood work came in, within about 48 hours, our doctor said, we've diagnosed you with multiple myeloma, IGA Kappa, P-17 deletion, 2 submutated genes. What does all that translate into? Because it was all Greek to my wife and I at the very beginning. What that translates into is that, Gregory, you are high risk, and we need to start you on chemo immediately. And remember how I said what my specialist said to us, we need to see an oncologist now, which really struck a chord. The words that I'm about to tell you right now that came from my oncologist, which really struck a chord, is, Mr. and Mrs. Proctor, get your affairs in order. To me, that was the catalyst that really just, it took my wife and I back as if we had been hit by a 30-foot wave and we knew we were drowning, because that was the most scariest phrase that anyone had said to us. We knew the cancer existed, but getting my affairs in order kind of consequented at the time, as we were listening to my doctor, as if, I was going to die.
It's obvious that when you or I, and I say this as a cancer survivor, when we get this horrific news, obviously it's horrific. So my question here is not as to whether it was horrific, but everybody is different. Everybody's diagnosis is different. The severity is different, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of variables in this equation. Given those variables, and perhaps given that that faith was something that was in your toolbox to deal with this, how did you deal with it? What was your reaction when you heard that? We already know the news was bad, but we all deal with it in different ways. Knowing what you now knew, how did you deal with it?
Well, first, for my wife and I, it was too surreal. We were dealing with something that neither one of us had any experience on, or yet anyone in our family had any experience on. And so the surrealness of it, as it became inevitable, it really put us in a situation to where we went into that depressive stage for probably 3 or 4 days. I was diagnosed like on a Friday. I started chemo on a Monday. So within that 48-hour period, the best thing we could do was consult with not only our pastors and ministers, but also our family and friends that wanted to wrap their arms around us and give us a sense of comfort. but we were just not prepared mentally, and we were not prepared physically, for the throes of what we were getting ready to encounter starting that following Monday.
Gregory, I'm a survivor of prostate cancer, and prostate cancer is a relatively high profile cancer, if that's the right characterization. But part and parcel of that is that there are numerous support avenues out there for those diagnosed with prostate cancer. Multiple myeloma doesn't have the same profile, again, if I'm using the right word. And I'm guessing that as a result, there were fewer support avenues for you. How difficult was it finding that necessary support?
Well, I'm glad you bring that question up. A lot of times, and I'm going to segue just briefly here, just for a moment. A lot of times when people are diagnosed, it's certainly something that you don't expect is ever going to happen to you. So you kind of have a little bit of this invincibility as you go through life, and you just say that, hey, I'm not going to. I hope that I'm never in this position. You're hoping that you're never in this position. So when you are embarked upon this position, I mean, it's just like starting grade school. It's just like starting high school or college. You have to get yourself educated, but you don't know where to look because you don't have these tools in your toolkit, and you don't have the family or friends that have gone through this experience that can share their wisdom and knowledge with you. And so therefore, you're still like a fish out of water. And so for my wife and I, we just really felt like early on in those stages, even though we were drowning with this devastating news, we still didn't know where to go to get educated. I mean, eventually we figured it out, but when you're in the throes of this within 48 hours of being diagnosed, you don't have a lot of time to do very much. You only have time to react and just try to get through the process to survive. And it wasn't until about maybe 2 weeks later that we really said to ourselves, after a friend mentioned to us, she says, you guys have got to get out of this depressive matic stage. You guys have got to focus in on the things that you guys do best. Greg, you are Superman. Greg, I've always seen you as being a guy that has the capability of being able to pull yourself out of anything. And just by her saying those words, push the envelope for me to get back to what I do best, and for me being a project manager and working with Fortune 500 companies and making companies billions of dollars, I said, okay, I've got to be able to do this for myself. I've got to be the project, and my wife's got to be the project manager, so that basically we can divide and conquer and take on this disease and not let this disease take on us. And as soon as we got ourselves calibrated to be able to do that, the whole dynamic changed for us. And, that's what I was mentioning earlier, is the educational piece, the awareness piece, and folks being able to understand, what's available out there. A lot of times you don't want to have to go to a website or go to a chat group because it's very depressive. You want to find sense of hope and admiration and uplifting, that's going to give you a sense of peace of mind and not be in the throes of all the negativity. You're already in the negativity from day one when you're diagnosed, And I apologize for going off on a tangent, but I figured I had to just kind of express that a little bit because I think it's really, really important, for those of us that are diagnosed with any cancer, is to ensure that, number one, you're not in this alone. And number two, I'd just like to say that, yeah, there's a lot of information out there, but you have to be cognizant and aware of where you go get that information. And certainly if you can latch hold to someone that has the experience, you're going to come out a lot better.
And this is why, Gregory, at the very outset, I mentioned that your story and this part of your story is something that can and should resonate with anybody who's been diagnosed with any cancer. Now, I want to talk about the chemotherapy part of your journey, but there is another part of this story that we briefly referenced early on, and we haven't circled back to. So I want to circle back to that right now. You had mentioned being immobilized at the very outset. In terms of your mobility, were you ambulatory? Were you confined to a wheelchair at the time that you started the chemo regimen?
So to paint the picture for your listeners, the tumor was the size of a grape, as long as an egg, on my upper right hip area. and it was going across my sciatic nerve. And so it radiated pain down my right leg, where it made it almost immobile for me to walk, be able to tie my shoes, for that matter, being able to balance. And then, of course, being across my sciatic nerve and all of the bone lesions that I had throughout my body, that caused me an extensive amount of pain as I was basically, trying to sleep and lay down vertical versus, or excuse me, lay down horizontal versus being vertical. So it caused a lot of immobility, and I'll say partial immobility, in the aspect of me being able to kind of do things on my own, and having that appreciation psychologically going through my mind, being a guy that was always self-sufficient and independent, played a psychological torment on me, because I had to rely on my wife and friends and family to kind of be in front of me as I'm going down the stairs so I don't fall, helping me tie my shoes, helping me get dressed. And those things were just something that I knew in my mind that I wanted to get beyond, because of the independency that I always had throughout my entire life. I didn't want this disease to rule my life that way.
Not a pleasant topic, but what was the toughest part of chemo?
The toughest part of chemo for me, Bruce, was, number one, again, not knowing. I mean, it took us a little bit of time to get up to speed. You hear stories about people going through chemo, the side effects, and various things that occur going through it. But for me, the toughest thing, I would have to say, for the first 2.5 months, I was on a 5-day-a-week regimen. So for 2.5 months, for me, that left me in a fog. That left me in a phase of not being able to kind of be very coherent, or really kind of in my life as I needed to be for trying to make decisions and do things that my wife and I enjoyed, because I just didn't have, a lot of the mental capacity, or should I say, I didn't have a lot of the physical strength as well.
How about the very notion of eating? Because when we speak to people who went through chemo, we hear almost the same story from everybody, and that is that eating and drinking becomes very unpleasant because everything tastes like metal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my regiment, just for your listeners and your viewers, my regiment was Darzalex, Velcade, and Dexamethasone. Obviously, the Velcade and Dexamethasone, or excuse me, the Velcade and the Darzalex are two kind of inhibitors that attack different parts of the protein as it relates to fighting the myeloma. But the Dexamethasone is a steroid. So for me, I started out this journey at about 175 pounds. With the steroids that I was taking, I was starting to eat like the Incredible Hulk, because my doctors were like, we want to make sure you put on a little weight before your stem cell transplant. We know that's a long ways out, but I can't risk the fact of you losing any weight at this point in time, because we want to try to get you as stable as possible. And so for me, my overall essence of appetite actually increased and went up. And of course, there was a lot of other side effects in dealing with the 3-drug regimen that I was on, but certainly I didn't lose sight of eating like other patients.
And if you would tell us a bit about the stem cell transplant.
Yeah, so my stem cell transplant commenced on February 8th, February 9th of 2022. This is after I had been under treatment from about July 9th, or excuse me, July 19th, July 20th of 2021 through December. And I actually achieved remission in October of 2021, which was a very significant accomplishment for me, because we always wanted to ensure that I achieve remission prior to the stem cell transplant. So my stem cell transplant commenced on February 9th. I was admitted into the hospital on February 8th. I spent approximately 11 days going through what they call hitting the bottom. And what that basically is just to kind of keep this in very simplistic terms. The first day, they injected me with a high dose of Melphalan. And what the Melphalan does is it basically kills off all of your immune system. And for me, it felt like they were putting me into a coma. I mean, to be honest with you, because once I was hit with the high dose of Melphalan, my body just felt warm on the inside. I felt very tired and sleepy, and so that was a weird sensational feeling for me. And when they came in and injected me with my stem cells on February the 9th, my body, as most people that go through a stem cell transplant, went through a rebirth process. So your stem cells are meant to be in your bone marrow. Of course, they inject you with 4 million stem cells, and now they're flowing through your bloodstream, trying to get back into your bone marrow. So my body was going through all types of, what's going on, as if it was fighting a disease and dealing with fevers and diarrhea and upset stomach and nausea and you name it. It was all happening over the course of the next 7 to 8 days I was in the hospital. But it wasn't quite as significant through the first 11 days as it was when I was discharged on the 11th day for about 12 hours or 14 hours. And I had to turn back around and go back into the hospital because I was running such a high fever, and went back into the hospital for another 8-day consecutive period of time as they ran through all these series of tests, only to result in engraftment syndrome. And engraftment syndrome is basically where my stem cells that were in my bloodstream are starting to reimpregnate themselves back into my bone marrow. And therefore, my body didn't know how to respond to that because, like I said earlier, your stem cells are normally inside your bone marrow. And so it was a very difficult time. And overall, I was in the hospital for about 21 days total.
And yet, with all of that, at some point, things veered in a good direction. When did you feel that your journey was starting to turn the corner? And again, I'll ask you, how did that manifest itself?
Yeah. My journey after my friend had talked to us, shortly after I was diagnosed, early on in the 2 weeks, I really wanted to focus on ensuring that if I could add a sense of awareness, a sense of inspiration, a sense of hope for individuals that were diagnosed, for me being able to share my journey, I would, hopefully, save others' lives. And so I would say that my journey of being able to understand the significance of the turning point started very early on, which is one of the reasons why I took to social media and became very, very transparent with regards to sharing all of the details and leaving it in such a positive light so that people would understand that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a beacon of hope out there. You just have to endure the process. But to answer your question based on post stem cell transplant, for the month of March, I could only walk about 15 miles. And so that was within a period of 1 month. So I went from my bed to the couch, because I didn't have much energy. My body was still trying to rebuild, and to kind of put it in a fallacy of, if you think about like a baby's learning to do things right after they're born, eating and so forth and so on. That's what my body was going through, except I'm 50 some odd years old at this stage, but my body feels like it's an infantile. And so that first month for me was extremely difficult, very painful. I was going through the war is me, wondering, to myself, why did I go through this? And so it wasn't until like April and May where my body really, I could just feel the energy, the significance of everything starting to kind of reboot itself and kick itself back into kind of a normal routine, where things were able to kind of feel better, and I was able to have a little bit more energy to get outside of my own house and be able to walk and have a little discomfort. And so those were the things that, as I mentioned on other interviews, is that, the significance of those things, they're very, very tough psychologically and physically. But, where I am today, it really is, worth the journey based on being diagnosed with such a horrific disease.
He is Gregory Proctor of San Antonio, Texas. He's a survivor of multiple myeloma, a rare blood cancer. And Gregory, as we continue on this positive path regarding your journey, if pre-diagnosis was 100%, when you were the picture of health and athletic. These days, how close are you to 100%?
Well, that's a very good question, Bruce. I question that a lot of times myself. I'm still in chemotherapy 2 times a month now. Where do I see myself as it relates to if I was 100% before versus where I am post? I would probably say that I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 percentile. And the reason why I say that is because you don't get everything back that you lose. I mean, let's just face it. When you go through something such as a horrific diagnosis, and you go through something such as a stem cell transplant, sometimes your mechanical skills, motor skills, your way of thinking, the clarification that you would always have, the spontaneity that people typically have. I think a lot of that is still there, but it's not at the millisecond reactive pace that I used to work at. And so for me, it's been somewhat of a little bit of an adjustment mentally, physically, and psychologically for me to say, okay, this may not be as good as it's going to get based on where I was, but I have to be able to kind of accept that and know that the one positive thing in life for me right now is that I'm still living. And, I can't discount the gratitude for the fact that I'm still living, and knowing that I still have an opportunity to elevate my voice and be able to share with others and be able to be that beacon of light to ensure that others have the information and the awareness to be able to fight this disease head on. Because it's something that, I don't wish upon anybody. This disease is probably one of the most expensive and hideous cancers that are out there today.
Gregory, we're going to wrap up now, and we always wrap up with the same question. You've already answered it at various points during this interview. So in a sense, I'm asking you to be redundant, but this sort of subject matter, I don't think it's a problem being redundant. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you've encountered somebody who's just been diagnosed with multiple myeloma. You have a private audience with them. You have a chance to impart a message to them. There are probably many things you want to say, but if there's one thing you want to say, one thing that towers over everything else, what would that be?
Well, it's been a mantra for me, throughout. Certainly, there's a lot of ways you could phrase this, but I think it's very important for everyone to understand that you should never give up. Don't ever give up, because once you let doubt, insecurity, and fear, get into your mind subconsciously, it becomes a much harder battle. And so, you need to try to find that mental fortitude. And that's why I've always preached a lot about don't give up, don't ever give up, because I think that's very, very important to get your mind right, even though things around you are totally chaotic and out of your control. But if you get your mind right, you can deal with taking it one day at a time. You can appreciate every moment. You can prioritize your health. You can spend time with your loved ones, because you don't know when your ticket may be called. And most importantly, you cannot take life for granted. And so don't ever give up, because those things are extremely, extremely important. It took me a lot to realize that, I'm in this position either based on by reason, by faith, or whatever it may be. But, I knew that if I was offered an opportunity to be able to go forward, I wanted to extend my voice to ensure that I could help those others out there to really understand that you're not fighting this battle alone.
Excellent. Gregory, thanks very much for an extremely articulate recitation of your journey and your message for others. We really appreciate the time that you've taken with us. Gregory Proctor, San Antonio, Texas. Thanks very much for being with us on Cancer Interviews.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much for having me.
And that's going to wrap up this episode. We want to remind you, as we always do at the end, and again, as articulated by Gregory Proctor, you are not alone in this journey. There are plenty of people out there like Gregory who have a message that can be uplifting as you go through your cancer journey, you or a loved one. So until next time, we'll see you on down the road.